Angus Taylor, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you, Dave.
So why shouldn't negative gearing be limited to just newly built housing stock, as even Joe Hockey suggested back then?
Well, thanks for having me, David. But look, the simple point about this is we won't support changes to negative gearing. And the reason is that we don't want to see more competition in the housing market coming from industry super funds and international investment funds, which is what would happen if Labor had their way. That's their intent. We know they're considering this. Their answers in the Parliament on this this week were very wishy-washy. They were all over the place. But more competition in the housing market from international investment funds and industry super funds is not the answer. The answer is we do have to have an alignment between housing supply and immigration. We've already announced that we've recommitted to superannuation for housing. It was a policy, of course, we took to the last election. It was a popular policy.
Accessing your super.
Yeah, exactly, which you were talking about a moment ago. And these are important policies, and we'll have more to say about this. We completely accept this is a really big deal for so many Australians. It is amongst younger Australians, and I see it with my own kids, a top line issue. We're focused on it, but taking away negative gearing is.
All right, so that's ruling out any negative gearing change. You've been asking the government all week to rule out negative gearing and other things. So just to go through a few other options, capital gains tax, trusts. You're not going to touch those either?
Well, David, again, we'll announce all our election policies before the election, but we're not proposing to go down those paths.
Look, like
let me be clear. We are absolutely committed to lower, simpler, fairer taxes. Right. We are absolutely committed to a back-to-basics economic agenda. We've seen a collapse in disposable incomes of Australians. We haven't seen in my lifetime on a sustained basis. 8.6%, $8,000 for the average Australian. I mean, I'm seeing people in food banks around this country I've never witnessed before, and they all say this. It has to be about getting the economy to work again, and the last 18 months has been disastrous with rising prices, 12 interest rate increases and 27% increase in personal income taxes being paid.
Well, just on that, I've heard you use that line. That's because more people are working, isn't it? The only tax change the government's made is the one you're supporting.
No, absolutely not. I mean, it's far more than that. We're seeing bracket creep working its ugly magic. It is the thief in the night, and it takes from Australians pay packets without them noticing until they see there's less in their bank account. That's one of the functions of inflation where wages haven't been able to keep up, and they haven't. We've also seen Limedo, of course, going. So there's been a very significant increase in taxes being paid. And many Australians, some whom will be watching this program, will have noticed they didn't get money back in their tax return last year that they had in previous years.
So just coming back to the question, though, about capital gains tax and trusts, I think you said you're not proposing to touch those.
No.
But do you rule it out? Because this is a demand you're making of the other side. Do you rule out?
We'll take our... Look, we are for lower, simpler, fairer taxes. But David, here's the point. Labor took to the last election promises that they didn't keep. On electricity prices, $275. We've heard it so many times before the election, 92 times from the Prime Minister, we didn't hear afterwards. Stage 3 tax cuts, a calculated lie. We now know that. We are not, but this is important, Dave. We're not going to make that mistake. What we take to the election, we will do. There's been too much loss of trust between Australians and leaders across politics, business, media, and it's our job to re-establish that trust. The breach of trust, the egregious breach of trust we've seen and betrayal we've seen from Labor in recent weeks with their calculated lies is not the way through. So we will work our way through our policies. They will be focused on lower, simpler, fairer taxes, on tax reform, in keeping with the Stage 3 tax cuts.
What about the GST? Would you touch that?
Look, again, David, raising the GST is certainly not my focus, and it's not going to be something that we'll be doing work on. But I tell you what we will be doing is taking strong tax policies like some we've already announced. We've already said that small business should have access to the same accelerated depreciation arrangements that they had prior to COVID. I mean, this is enormously important. We have to get our economy working again. There's no amount of redistribution you can do that makes up for the $8,000 that the average Australian has lost, and the $20,000 or $30,000 that many Australian families have lost.
I've heard that point.
Who have mortgages.
Okay.
yeah, you've got to get the economy working, and only Liberals understand that. That's about mobilising workplaces, mobilising businesses, getting people out there
but on tax,
aspiring.
Just on tax, you've been getting into the government all week because they on negative gearing say we have no plans to touch it, and yet on the GST, capital gains tax and trusts, you've used very similar language.
Well, let's look at what the government has been doing. We know from Stephen Kennedy this week, he spoke, of course, on Friday, that the government, Treasury, was working on these tax changes for a long time. We know that.
But I'm asking about your position.
And so
you're not ruling out these
we haven't got a Treasury doing that kind of work. So it's right and proper that we ask what they're doing.
Okay.
Now, we have every indication that they've been looking at negative gearing. And let me tell you something about what we've seen this week. We support tax relief because at the end of the day, the failed management of the economy from Labor means Australians deserve better. The real problem with what Labor has proposed here is that they're funding that tax relief by breaching a promise that they made over 100 times. And we want them to lay out the options that they considered. Why is it that they chose a funding model for this tax relief that involved such a breach of trust?
Would you promise to keep those stage 3 tax cuts too, of course, and now you're supporting?
No, we're not. This is the important point. This is the point I was making. We support the tax relief not because that's the very best option. The best option is to manage the economy properly, but because after 18 months of failed management by Labor, Australians are hurting badly for all the reasons I've explained.
So because of the circumstances
what we don't support is funding that through a betrayal of the Australian people and broken promises. Now, the question is, what options did Labor look at in this process? On your show, Anthony Albanese said he had released all the documentation. That is clearly not true, another lie. Well, give us the options. What were the other options that Labor looked at in the course of this process?
In terms of where you now go on tax reform, you've said strong tax reform you'll take to the election. You want to keep in the principle of those original stage 3 cuts. What are those principles you'd like to keep?
Well, the first principle is deliver on what you say. And I don't say that lightly, David. I mean, the erosion of trust I've seen in recent years for leadership in every domain of Australian society is, I think, terrifying for the implications for our future. So we've got to get that trust back. That's incumbent on you, on me, on everybody else. The second principle is lower, simpler, fairer taxes. We believe in that firmly as a Liberal Party. That's why we've had fights over tax policy in the 2013 election, the 2019 election, the most recent election, of course. We'll continue to take up the torch on lower, simpler, fairer taxes. Fighting bracket creep, rewarding aspiration and hard work. I mean, these are hugely important principles, not dividing Australians unnecessarily. These are the principles that will give us that strong economy, low inflation economy that we need, and the economy that can actually deliver for Australians again, as Labor has failed over the last 18 months.
You've previously committed to undoing Labor's change on superannuation. They've reduced the tax break for bigger accounts, those with 3 million or more in their super. I think that's going to cost you around $2 billion a year. Is that still a commitment, or does that go into the mix of what you more broadly want to do now?
No, that's absolutely. We've made that. We've made that commitment.
So whatever you do is on top of that.
Well, of course, and we haven't seen. Obviously, the budget, it'll come in May. No doubt Labor's going to want to spend a lot more money. I mean, as soon as they see some money, they spend it. That's what Labor does. And that's the challenge, of course, is finding the money as Labor keeps spending it. They've spent an extra $209 billion since they came to power. David, that's $20,000 for every Australian household, and there's no sign of that stopping. So we'll have to work within the budget constraints that Labor creates as they spend the money as they always do.
So just a final one on tax, and I guess this is a question about ambition, really. We mentioned earlier that opposition's trying to take big tax reform to elections. We've seen not so successful John Hewson, Bill Shorten, and so on. Are we looking at sweeping tax reform, serious tax reform that you'll take to the election, or is it going to be more tokenistic?
Well, we are very ambitious to get the economy back on track. You just can't have a hit of that scale, unprecedented in our lifetimes. We can't take a hit of that scale to Australian standard of living and whilst Labor thinks the answer is to just move money around to change the slices of the pie, the answer is actually to get back to basics.
So you're up for a serious reform.
Well, and you know, whether it's industrial relations, where we've opposed the government's position, whether it's competition policy, where all we've seen from Labor is crony capitalism, whether it's aligning immigration with housing supply. I mean, these are all crucial issues.
But you are on tax willing to do something big. You could even look at the GST. You've left that.
Oh, no, honestly, David, raising the GST in the middle of a cost of living crisis is not something that a Liberal's going to support. I mean, let's be clear.
So you won't go to the election with any change on GST?
Don't put words on that sort of thing. But that's obviously not going to be a focus. Look, if Labor wants to raise the GST, they should be clear.
No, I'm asking. Just to be clear for viewers, that's not on the table.
So in the middle of a cost of living crisis, your focus has to be on bringing prices of things down, not up.
Right.
And that will be our focus over the next months as we bring together our policies.
Let me ask you about industrial relations. The government's latest changes passed through the Senate. The coalition's been sharply critical throughout all of this, whether it's the right to disconnect, whether it's the multi-employer bargaining. Will you roll it all back?
We'll certainly take a targeted package of repeals to the next election. There's no question about that. We're opposing the legislation. We've been unambiguous in that position. And I tell you why, David, we've seen behind that collapse in living standards is an unprecedented collapse in labour productivity in this country. This is not the grinding challenge the world has had with productivity over many years. This is a collapse of 6.1% in labour productivity in the last 18 months. Now, if that's the case, people can't be paid more on a sustainable basis. This is an important part of the reason why standards of living have collapsed. We have to get back on track here. And the key to that is to get employers and employees working together to make their workplaces more prosperous, more productive, more competitive, and not to put union officials in the middle to try and impose their views of the world. We've got to get our workplaces back to that focus on.
So what would you
on a prosperous?
What would you undo? I mean, the right to disconnect.
Well, obviously, and you know,
and multi-employer bargaining.
Peter Dutton has said that in the last hour or so.
Multi-employer bargaining too.
Well, and there's aspects of that piece of legislation that are unacceptable. But I'm not going to preempt Michaelia Cash, who will bring forward those policies. And as always, with our policies, and I'll emphasise this, we want to do things that are achievable. And that we're going to remain committed to. We're not going to do what Labor has done. Getting things through the Senate on industrial relations is always hard, so it will be a targeted package, and it has to be.
Vehicle emissions standard. The government unveiled its long-awaited plans earlier in the week. You've labelled them a ute tax. We know at least some of your colleagues previously supported a vehicle emissions standard, but I think the criticism here is about the model that's been put forward by the government. Can you just clarify for us, is it that level of ambition in the government's plan, or is it the very idea of a vehicle emissions standard that you oppose?
Now, what we oppose is anything that's going to increase the price of the most popular cars in Australia. That's what we oppose. And it's a very similar point to your question on the GST. In the middle of a cost of living crisis, you don't impose a policy that's going to increase the cost of living for Australians.
But you could have a standard with a less ambitious trajectory. Is that?
You know what? If it's not going to increase or distort the pricing, so what's the point? And look, Chris Bowen here, this is the minister who said he was going to get electricity prices down by $275. We're not seeing any sign of that. This will increase the price of vehicles, and you only have to look at the documentation.
Some vehicles, maybe not others.
Well, the most popular vehicles in Australia are the Hilux and the Ranger, and if any vehicle prices are going to go up, it's going to be those. Let's be clear about that. And if you look at the documentation carefully, you will see there's penalty provisions that they're proposing of $100 per gram kilometre, David. Now, for a Hilux and a Ranger, that is a very significant penalty. And the idea that customers won't end up paying that, you've got to be kidding. I mean, and we've seen this in other markets, like New Zealand.
The government says it won't drive up prices.
Chris Bowen says it won't. And how credible is he after what he took to the last election?
On renewables more generally, the Nationals are now saying halt the rollout of renewables in the regions. Do you agree?
Well, it's very clear that the 28,000 kilometres of transmission lines and all that goes with it is having huge impacts on our regions, and we have to get it back under control.
But do you back the Nats in saying...
Well, I do say that there's been overreach by Labor. There's no question about that.
But you're not going that far.
I'm just saying there's been overreach. We'll take our policies, as always, to the next election, and we'll make sure they're policies we can keep. As always, with any projects, there's good projects and bad projects, but 28,000 kilometres of transmission lines and a big loss of prime agricultural land that we're starting to see right across Australia. We think there's a better way. Ted O'Brien is working away on this. We've already said quite a lot about energy policy in recent times, and we'll continue to.
Look, just a final one. Barnaby Joyce, as you know, was filmed lying on a footpath after Parliament had risen the other night. Are you comfortable with the explanations he's given for this, or does this raise a concern for you about standards of behaviour?
Look, people love to jump to conclusions on these things, and I'm certainly not doing that, and I don't think anyone should. I think the primary issue for us is Barnaby's welfare, and we will remain focused on that. I certainly will remain focused on that.
When you say that, is he okay?
Well, he clearly wasn't at the time, so that's something that we're going to focus on, and we should focus on. That's always got to be the focus when these sorts of things happen. But the jumping to conclusions we've seen, David, it's a bit of a habit in the modern world. I see that, but it's not appropriate.
You'd say the same if it was a Labor.
I think jumping to conclusions on any of these things, we've seen too much of that lately.
Angus Taylor, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Good on you, Dave.